Welcome to day 6 of Urbanization, AP Human Geography, Mr. Bidwell's class. Today's content objective: explain the problems to future cities and future urban developments. Specifically, be able to perform the following: define filtering, redlining, public housing, gentrification, racial steering, and underclass. 2. Describe the processes of deterioration and gentrification in cities. 3. Explain the problems of permanent underclass and culture of poverty in cities. 4. Describe the difficulties that cities face in paying for services, especially in a recession. Changes in urban geography. When we look at the process of deterioration, well, first we have to understand that central cities really hit the low point in the 1970s when New York City went bankrupt. The Bronx was burning, crime was at an all-time high, and then more recently, pundits proclaimed that it was the end of the cities, as the last digital communication technology, the fax machines, internet, wireless, and so on, would eliminate the need for face-to-face interaction. However, we'll talk about how that did not prove true. Nonetheless, we see these problems. Filtering is when you have subdivisions of the older, usually Victorian-style houses that are owned by a slumlord, and they will create many multiple units. And these slumlords or landlords will not maintain these properties, which creates loss of economic feasibility for the future, but nonetheless profits in the meantime because he or she is able to sublet or subdivide these large houses into smaller units. Redlining is another process that deteriorates the central city. That's when banks, specifically mortgage lenders, will draw a line literally on a map, and they will show areas where they'll refuse to give money to certain groups. And typically the groups were the impoverished socioeconomic classes, which tended to have higher levels of minority ethnic groups. Redlining was made illegal, but it's still seen throughout today because it's extremely difficult to enforce. Just think about what we learned about with legal segregation in suburbs. Very difficult to enforce when you have housing developments that have a starting house for $500,000. Not many people can pay that type of mortgage. So again, it's really difficult to prove if redlining is happening. If you're interested, I did post an article about redlining potentially in Eden Prairie, Minnesota on my Google webpage. Next is racial steering. This is when real estate agents show only houses to certain ethnic groups and certain neighborhoods to ethnic groups. This is a great video on redlining. Again, if you're interested in learning the process, it's on slide 141. All right, public housing. So again, public housing is a deterioration of the city, and it poses many challenges. Within public housing, we see the underclass will mostly be found in public housing. Public housing is government-owned housing rented to low-income families, where they set the rent 30% of the tenant's income. So it varies based on the income of the tenant. Then local governments or nonprofit organizations such as charitable groups will build and own much of the housing, aided to the subsidies for the national government. So again, we see most is controlled by local government, but and the federal government pays for all the expenses not covered by the rent. But now what we see with public housing, if you watch the video, most public housing now is controlled by for-profit corporations. All right, when we look at high-rise public housing, that was mostly areas of the city where you saw public housing in the 50s and 60s. If you're more interested, look at Cabrini Green in Chicago is a great example of what is referred to as high-rise public housings. These were very while these areas are very dilapidated, not well maintained apartment complexes, which are extremely unsatisfactory to families and children. The high rises between the government started to diminish the high rises in about between 1980 and 2010, and they started to increase the number of houses, which were for low income earners. Some of the problems that were seen, obviously, with the environment that within these apartments, it congregated, or I mean, it concentrated low income earners that tended to, with lack of um, maintenance, they had broken down elevators, juvenile terrorization, crime, and drugs that are all associated with the underclass and low income. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. All right, so again, houses are built. Section 8 houses are built starting in the 1980s and continuing today. All right, there's an example of some high rises that started again coming down. This one says in the 70s, but 70s and 80s into the 2010s. All right, and again, a great video that shows how public housing works today. Slide 144. Okay, so now we have changing urban landscape, and there's the revival of the central city. When we look at the central city, well, we know that the central city was at its peak during the industrial economies. In the late 20th century, it began to decline, and now, or the mid 20th century, it began to decline, and then now we see the reemergence of the central city in late 20th century. So when we look at the decline of deindustrialization, factories moved out, they moved to suburbs, it created brownfields, food deserts in the central cities. Remember, brownfields are now the vacant buildings and the open parking lots, the concrete jungles that remain vacant, and the food deserts are areas where now all those retail and wholesale consumer services went out to the suburbs, leaving many limited options for city dwellers or central city dwellers to access healthy food. And then rail lines were vacant, smokestacks created pollution and pollution in water, and really created a movement to revitalize cleanup of the waters. And so these industrial waterfronts are huge for redevelopment of city, which is which we're going to talk about. New is another strategy of new urbanism and urban revival of the central city. Again, they'll build retail along those waterfronts. They'll build cafes. They'll build other consumer service stores for the revitalization of those areas. And then we begin to see gentrification in the 21st century. Gentrification is the process of converting an urban neighborhood from predominantly low income, renter occupied to predominantly middle class. So you're reviving these areas for middle class. Most cities have at least one sustainable, renovated inner city neighborhood in them that has attracted high income earners to these areas. These renovations of the have had tremendous effect on the low income class and displacing them out of their gentrified neighborhoods. All right. Okay. Again, gentrification. Who's it target? You're looking at middle income class, and the architecture and the services will reflect that. Culturally, and it turns into recreational space, and then the another reason is communities to reduce less. And there's also a term that's used in geography called things double income, no kids. They tend to reside there, and elderly tend to reside in these neighborhoods as a draw to the recreational and consumer service space with also the limit, without the need for a car or in expansive mobility. But there is tremendous effect with gentrification and the effect it has on the poor classes, predominantly minority ethnic groups, most explicitly African American ethnicity. I mean, there have been many negatives because what happens is you have low income, frequently minority families that are displaced. Um, it's the continuous making of neighborhoods, and so they're inflating rent and price, and so they force them out to um, other areas of the city that are less desirable and where they don't share the same culture. All right, and this shows you an example of gentrification. And here's Soho neighborhood in New York where area's been gentrified. Oops, sorry, you can see with the consumer service activities and the revitalization of the buildings and new urbanism techniques, wide walking streets and trees that go all along the sidewalk. All right, so the underclass is the permanent underclass. These are the endless cycle of economic and social problems, predominantly African American ethnicity, which we learned about with the intra-regional migration in the 1950s. Of when white flight happened in the 50s, African Americans interregionally moved from the core central city to outlining central city areas, and they became clustered in enclaves. And with the underclass, they are suffer from high rates of unemployment. When you have unemployment, it leads to alcoholism, drug addiction, illiteracy, delinquency, and crime. And then they have deteriorated schools. When you don't have, it's very similar to deindustrialization. When you don't have employment, then there's not a property tax that doesn't go into that. Then you don't have money that goes into the tax base that helps fund social programs such as schools. Affordable housing is difficult to secure, as you saw with public housing. People that are needed, not everyone qualifies for it. And then they tend to be, they ignore good learning habits, so they don't adhere to um, the importance of studying for tests or homework or completing or showing up to class every day um, because they don't have a job and they have harsh living conditions and they don't have deteriorated schools and schools that don't reinforce excellence. And then you have the zone of abandonments within the underclass areas where there is limited public services and there's limited. So with limited public services, you have inadequate police control, inadequate firefighter help, and then the limit on consumer services, which create food deserts. Okay, we can see the ethnic enclaves that are found within Chicago, and we can see um, clearly areas that um, would form. Um, well, the African American, you can see how it falls. The underclass follows the interstate highway, which you already learned. There's always going to be Martin Luther King boulevards along major interstate highways where African Americans tended to be clustered in cities. And because of redlining and blockbusting and racial steering, they ended up in those areas. And with that, it creates that cycle of poverty. All right, the cycle of poverty is largely affects women mostly. When we see residents trapped, unwed mothers compose of 3/4 of the babies in the U.S. in inner cities. 3/4 have one parent. Again, the propensity of drug abuse. And you can see the article on how black mothers and babies are in a life or death crisis. All right, it also affects women differently in urban areas. When we look at women, we can see that cities they don't experience the same view of a city. So um, they face the imminent fear of danger, where they're going to be eminently or the fear of sexual harassment. For example, they may restrict women's mobility in certain areas or certain times of day, denying them access to public space enjoyed by men. Um, we see, again, there's more women that tend to live in urban areas, and there tended to be um, single family households. Uh, Childcare costs and low wages are a major cause of poverty. Um, Traditional women jobs are concentrated and inaccessible to male jobs, so women tend to be found dispersed in cities, and because they take on more clerical or administrative roles within central cities, they rely on mass transit and have shorter journeys. The cost of living is more expensive, primarily because of the child care costs. And inferior transportation is dangerous, especially during non-peak hours. Suburban women have a different experience in urban areas. Confines women with very few choices. Predominantly in suburban areas, males are paid as the wage earner, where you have moms that don't work. And with those limited options, it creates a different view of the urban landscape. And so oftentimes the female will stay home and raise the children. All right. Other challenges that face urban areas, you have low-income areas where there aren't many services because there's little money that goes into taxation. So what can cities do? There's two approaches they can do to close this gap with the lack of public services. They can either reduce services, which is the austerity approach, or they can raise tax revenues, which is the stimulus approach. All right, that takes us to the end. Oh, I'm sorry. And lastly, recession can have a huge effect on the housing and the urban challenges. We see with the subprime mortgage crisis of 2008, the recession that came with it, it lowered the values of the houses, lowered the tax base, lowered the properties, lowered the money that went in to social safety programs such as health care and um, energy and infrastructure and other environmental regulations or public housing or food security, etc. Uh, and so this can also lead to foreclosures. And we can see what happens when you have foreclosures, and the two maps show us where foreclosures happened in the city of Houston in 2011 primarily affect the classes that would be the underclass or the culture of poverty, which again are a high percentage of minority ethnic groups, as seen in the map below. And that takes us to the end of notes. As always, please go to the conclusion write-up